How Christian Zionism amplifies the Cyrus narrative, and why it produces bystanders. Christian Zionism does not begin with politics. It begins with training the imagination. For decades, Christians, particularly in the United States and Europe, have been taught to read the modern world through a specific biblical filter: Israel at the center, prophecy as destiny, and history as a countdown rather than an unfolding. Within this framework, the past is already written, the future is already determined, and the present exists primarily to confirm what Scripture is believed to have foretold. This is the soil in which the Cyrus narrative flourishes. The Cyrus template, modernized Cyrus the Great, functions in Scripture as a powerful psychological template, a foreign ruler, morally imperfect, divinely used to advance Israel's restoration. Christian Zionism resurrects this template and projects it forward into modern geopolitics. When a contemporary leader is framed as a modern Cyrus, something subtle but profound happens. Power is no longer judged by ethics. Violence is no longer weighed by consequence. Policy is no longer evaluated by human cost. It is evaluated by alignment. Does this action move Israel forward? Does it advance prophecy? Does it fit the timeline believers were taught to expect? If the answer is yes, moral discomfort is overridden by theological reassurance. This is not accidental. It is conditioning, retraining Christians to become observers, not participants. Christian Zionism quietly retrains believers away from responsibility and toward spectatorship. The world is framed as a fallen place, not a living, evolving system, but a doomed stage set for final judgment. Earth is no longer understood as a creative, participatory environment, but as a temporary hell to be endured until escape. Once that framing is internalized, several things follow naturally. Suffering becomes inevitable. Not urgent war becomes confirmation. Not tragedy, collapse becomes prophecy fulfilled. Not failure. Christians are no longer asked, what should we prevent? They are asked, what are we witnessing? That shift is everything. The bystander effect, theologically justified. When believers are taught that chaos, war, and displacement are necessary steps toward a divine conclusion, intervention begins to feel inappropriate, even rebellious. Why interfere with God's plan? Why resist what Scripture says must happen? This creates a population that does not need to be persuaded to support violence. They simply need to stand aside. Christian Zionism does not require cruelty. It requires passivity. And passivity, at scale, is powerful. The Abrahamic frame is a shared constraint. This isn't limited to Christianity. The Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all carry apocalyptic frameworks that center land, chosen peoples, end times conflict, and divine mandate. While they differ theologically, they converge structurally. Each frames history as a struggle over sacred territory. Each embeds suffering into destiny. Each sanctifies violence when it aligns with divine narrative. Christian Zionism becomes the bridge that translates ancient covenant theology into modern Western political support, especially for Israel. This support is not primarily strategic, it is eschatological. Israel is not supported because of what it does, but because of what it represents in the story believers have been taught to expect. That distinction is crucial. How this enables expansion without accountability. When Israel's actions are absorbed into prophecy rather than politics, critique becomes heresy rather than analysis. To question outcomes is framed as questioning God. To grieve consequences is framed as lacking faith. To resist escalation is framed as opposing Scripture. In this way, the narrative protects itself. Christian Zionism doesn't need to argue facts on the ground. It only needs to remind believers this was foretold. And once that reminder is accepted, entire populations become emotionally anesthetized to suffering, not because they don't care, but because they believe caring changes nothing. The cost of this lens, the deepest loss here is not geopolitical. It is existential. A planet that could be understood as creative, relational, and evolving is rebranded as a battlefield destined for destruction. Humanity's role shifts from steward to witness, from co-creator to bystander, from responsibility to resignation, and that resignation is framed as righteousness. The insight that breaks the spell here is the insight that destabilizes the entire structure. Belief systems that teach people the world must burn will always find reasons not to stop the fire. Christian Zionism does not merely interpret events, it pre-authorizes outcomes. And once outcomes are pre-authorized, power moves without resistance, not because people are evil, but because they were taught that this is how the story ends.